Welcome everyone to another installment of the Fall Environmental Resilience Speaker Series, jointly presented by Indiana University's Integrated Program in the Environment and the Environmental Resilience Institute. I'm Sarah Mincy, I'm the Director of the Integrated Program in the Environment, and I'm so pleased that you're able to join us today. Both IPE and ERI are founded on the understanding that interdisciplinary learning and research are essential to teach today's scholars and to solve today's problems, not to mention tomorrow's. The natural and social sciences, the humanities, and the arts are all critical and in play as we tackle climate change and the environmental challenges that are affecting our health, our communities, and our economy here in Bloomington and around the world. IPE was founded in 2012 by the provost and the leadership of the O'Neill School, the College of Arts and Sciences, and the School of Public Health to bring together all of the environmental and sustainability scholarship across the various schools and departments on the Bloomington campus. ERI was founded in 2017 as a part of the IU Prepared for Environmental Change Grand Challenge. Its mission is to enhance resilience to environmental change in Indiana and beyond by accurately predicting impacts and effectively partnering with communities to implement feasible, equitable, and research-informed solutions. IPE and ERI faculty and staff and students have worked together to bring us a full semester worth of speakers, and we're rounding out this fall with today's talk. Next semester, we will continue the series beginning on January 22nd with former Indiana Congressman and CEO for Researchers for the Future, Phil Sharp. So that should be an exciting talk. You'll be able to find information about each talk on the ERA and the IPE web pages and in regular newsletters and upcoming event notices that our organizations regularly send out. And we encourage you to sign up for our newsletters so you'll get reminders about those upcoming talks as well as other news and events we publicize. If you have ideas for people that you think would be good for a future talk, let us know that too. Finally, just a couple logistics on how to engage today with our speakers. You can remain muted, but put your questions in the chat and do that as you think of them so that we can gather some, and we'll be monitoring them throughout the talk, and there'll be an opportunity for questions at the end that I can ask for you. So at long last, please allow me to introduce today's speaker, Jeremy Kranowitz. Kranowitz has served for over 25 years in leadership roles to launch initiatives, raise awareness, and build coalitions that promote diverse, sustainable, and beautiful communities. Prior to his role with Keep Indianapolis Beautiful, Kranowitz was Managing Director for Sustainability of Hazan, an organization focused on building an environmentally sustainable world for all, with specific emphasis toward impacting change in Jewish communities. Previously, Kranowitz was founder and manager of furtherwithfood.org, where he built a public-private partnership among government agencies, major trade associations, and environmental and hunger relief nonprofits to combat food loss and waste. Prior to that, he was executive director and president of Sustainable America, a national nonprofit that provides tools and solutions for action toward a sustainable future. Kranowitz also has served at the Keystone Policy Center as a mediator and an educator to resolve complex multi-stakeholder environmental disputes. He launched the center's Youth Policy Summit, where high school students learn to become effective leaders on critical policy issues. Kranowitz has also managed operations at the launch of Forest Trends, an international sustainable forestry nonprofit. Jeremy has a BA and an MS in environmental science from Johns Hopkins and an MPA in environmental policy from New York University. So welcome, Jeremy. We're really pleased to have you today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah, and thanks for the lovely introduction. I am now going to see if I can share my screen. Can folks see that okay?
Yes, that looks good.
Okay, great. So thank you for that. I am delighted to be here and to speak with all of you, and thought to focus this conversation on the reasons why I think it's so interesting and important from an environmental resilience perspective to think about ways that we can engage more with the faith-based community. So I'm a Johnny Cash fan, and for folks that are familiar with his music, he has this fun song called If the Lord's Willin' and the Creek Don't Rise, and thought that would be a lovely way to kick off and title this presentation. So there we go. So Sarah said some nice introductory remarks, and a lot of it is just on this slide is repeated. I do want to show, this was actually a fun shot of me at the Global Climate Action Summit, which Governor Brown hosted in California just a couple of years ago. And I had the opportunity there to speak on a interfaith panel. We spoke concurrently at the same time that Harrison Ford was on the main stage. We were on a smaller stage, but so didn't have quite the same crowd that Han Solo received, but have been thinking about opportunities to work with interfaith groups to try to make a difference on the environment for a while. So as was mentioned, I'm the president and CEO of Keep Indianapolis Beautiful. For folks who are not as familiar, Keep Indianapolis Beautiful is a over 40-year-old organization. It was actually started in the late 1970s by Mayor Hudnut, who developed a public service campaign around with a basketball theme on the Hudnut hook, where he was shown making a hook shot of getting litter into the proper receptacles. And it actually started as a part of city government, but then very quickly spun off to be an independent 501c3 nonprofit, and has been for, as I said, for over 40 years. We do three main types of work to make the city cleaner, greener, and more beautiful. One is we continue to work on litter abatement. What are the opportunities that we have to encourage folks to pick up litter? And also, what are the opportunities for us to encourage people to stop littering in the first place? The second big area of focus for us is on trees. And I know this is of special interest to Sarah, but we partner with both the city and with our water utility, Citizens Energy Group, to plant thousands of trees throughout the city every year. And I'm going to be talking about that in more depth in this presentation. And the third area where we spend a lot of time is in creating green spaces. And so if there are parts of the city or neighborhoods that do not have access to a good green space, we work with those neighborhoods to create green spaces that meet the needs of the neighborhood. We don't just come in and say, here's what you need. We actually work in partnership and try to create the right type of space with the based on the neighborhood needs, whether that is providing a place to sit down and contemplate butterflies and other pollinators, or whether that is a place for some play equipment or what have you, but try to fashion that to the needs of the neighborhood. So those are really the three main actions that KIB takes to make the city a greener place and a better place to live. I'm going to talk a little bit more about KIB in a minute, but first I just actually want to talk about some of the other work that I have done leading up to my present role. And one of those that I wanted to mention is something that Sarah mentioned in her introductory remarks. I spent some time both at Sustainable America and then thereafter really looking at the issue of food loss and waste. Several years ago, there was a seminal book called American Wasteland by an author named Jonathan Bloom. And around the same time, there was a really important report that came out from the Natural Resources Defense Council entitled simply Wasted. And both pointed to the same problem, that about 40% of all the food that is grown in this country does not get eaten. It either was getting plowed under by the farmer because there wasn't a good market for it. It was getting wasted at the grocery store or the restaurant, or just as likely was going to waste in residential refrigerators, in each of our refrigerators. And there started to be a number of different conferences and workshops and efforts where different folks were coming together and different stakeholders. And there was this common refrain, which was, gosh, it seems like there is already starting to be some redundancy of effort in trying to tackle these issues. And it seems like there are some aspects to trying to deal with this that are nobody's addressing yet, and we ought to try to figure out where the gaps are and the holes are in the research and the efforts to address it. And so I actually brought together a number of different stakeholders. It included folks from the federal government, from EPA and from USDA. It included folks from industry. I needed to bring in industry, so I brought in the grocery manufacturers and the food marketers and the restaurant association. And then needed to also bring in a number of nonprofits as well, including hunger relief organizations like Feeding America, including environmental think tanks like World Resources Institute, and including some that you might not think of right off the bat that would be interested in food waste, like World Wildlife Fund. But in fact, WWF, this is one of their big efforts right now, because if you think of all of the rainforest that needs to be chopped down to grow crops or to raise livestock for food that then ultimately isn't eaten, it creates a biodiversity problem. And so that's why WWF is so engaged in this idea of limiting food loss. But the important thing is that it was really important to bring all of these different stakeholders together, because each of them was coming with a different frame of reference, a different thing that was most critical that they thought needed to be addressed. And really, it helped collectively identify who could focus most on what and do it in the best way. And so, for example, there could have been folks that said, I'm going to make the world's greatest infographic on unused onions. And in fact, there may have been 2 or 3 groups that had already created such a thing and said, you know what, that research, that effort already exists. You should focus on something entirely different that you could do better, because the stuff that's out there is already really good. So let's marshal our resources effectively. So I just want to talk about this because I think it's a good prelude to the next thing that I want to mention, which is I've used a framework when I build coalitions and build groups together that looks, it's an acronym called STEEPLE. Some people have just used STEP. I added the extra letters to make it more like a church steeple. But what I want to do when I'm building a coalition to try to address complex environmental issues is really think about different facets in society that need to be considered. And so one of those is thinking about the social aspects, the technological aspects of dealing with this issue, the economic issues, both current market conditions and what future economic conditions might be in terms of jobs and taxes. Importantly, from a university perspective, thinking about what the educational opportunities and the educational aspects of this are. Of course, it's important to think about the political and legal aspects. And I think about that as big P politics in terms of, congressmen and legislators and mayors and city councilors, but also small P politics of just thinking about what's important in the community. And then the last letter that I like to think about is, of course, what are the environmental aspects of this issue? And so when I'm building coalitions and thinking about how to address these issues, I like to first frame it through this type of steeple analysis, because I think that when we start to consider all of these factors, we start to think about opportunities that aren't ignoring a particular stakeholder or aren't overlooking an important factor that we need to consider. So coming back to KIB then for a minute, I mentioned the things that KIB does, but actually I think of the organization more like a catalyst for change. We are doing all of these different efforts to try to make Indianapolis in particular a greener, cleaner city. But really, even though we can bring trees and tools and so forth, we are really about bringing people together to make this happen. One of the reasons why the city has a contract with us is because in a typical year, we can mobilize over 15,000 people to come out and volunteer their time to clean up their neighborhoods, to come together for a corporate volunteer day of service, to gather in a large community to do a big neighborhood cleanup. And while there may be some latent desire to do some of that work, it doesn't happen without an organization like KIB to really be that catalyst for change, to tell them, okay, here's the thing that we're all going to be working on, here's where we're going to meet, here's how we're going to do it, and really motivating and encouraging and loving all of that community activity. So as we all know, 2020 has not been a typical year. And in fact, we have been able to do a lot of the work that we need to get done, but it has been truthfully quite hard for us to get all of the work done that we want to do just with staff and with a small number of students and volunteers and others. We really do need to find ways to continue to work with folks that want to come out, but also want to do that safely and particularly during the pandemic. So I want to actually just turn for a minute to an interesting contract that KIB has had with Citizens Energy Group and talk about some of the lessons we've learned and how we are continuing to evolve as we work our way through this contract, because again, I think it is interesting and builds up to where I'm leading, which is conversations about really about the faith community. So we had conversations with Citizens Energy, which had a federal mandate to clean up the White River. As folks may know, Indianapolis, but also places throughout the state of Indiana, have many combined sewer overflows. So what that means is that during heavy rain events, and really a heavy rain event can sometimes be just as little as a quarter of an inch, but that causes both rainwater and sewage to commingle, and then it all gets flushed into the White River and causes these pollution events. And so Citizens Energy was ordered to clean up the river, and mostly they are going to be able to do that through a deep tunnel project, which is ongoing, and it's improving the sewer system in the city. However, it did not get them 100% of the way to where they needed to be. And so KIB is partnering with Citizens Energy, not on the gray material that in terms of building new sewers and pouring new concrete, but on the green side of things. And so it was determined by citizens hydrologists that if we planted 10,000 trees in critical places around the city, those trees, once mature, would each be able to divert over 10,000 gallons of water per year from their canopy and from their roots. And so that would, in addition to the work on updating the sewer system, would be able to get citizens to the place where they needed to get in terms of cleaning up the White River. So part of that is that we did an analysis. There are actually over 100 combined sewer overflow basins just in Marion County. But we were able to do a ranking system where one of the things that we looked at, of course, was what the opportunity was in each of those basins to plant more trees. If there was already a good tree coverage, that wasn't a great spot. So we needed to have low tree canopy, we needed to have plantable space. But we also looked at some demographic criteria in terms of median household income, whether the percent of non-white residents, population density, et cetera, and created this map of a top, actually not a top 20, but a top 21 list of basins where we would do our work over the period of this contract. So just to give a quick idea, when we start to map this out, this is one of the basins, and this is on the near east side of Indianapolis, and each of those dots represents a plantable spot. We were actually trying to find 700 trees to plant in this particular basin, and these are over 900 plantable spaces. And we often will try to find more spaces than we need trees to plant for an important reason. This is in the day before we go out to plant trees, we will often drop the trees and mark where they're going to go in advance. And there are neighbors that don't always love that idea. So this is a story that I want to tell about why, again, engaging with different stakeholders is so important. But this was a tree planting that was scheduled for the Riverside community on the west side of Indy. And we were able to engage with some neighbors along Riverside Drive. And one neighbor said, "Oh my gosh, this is such a fantastic thing. I've been wanting to have more trees here." And that neighbor talked us up all up and down the street. And when we went to go and plant there, all the neighbors said, "Oh, this is so fantastic. Yes, of course, we want to have trees here." And you can see all of those green check marks in the top part of my screen. On the bottom side of the screen on Pruitt Street, we had more of a curmudgeonly neighbor. And as we talked to that neighbor, they determined that trees were a terrible idea. They did not want to have to mow around the tree because it was going to be in the strip between the sidewalk and the street. They were worried about limbs falling and having to pick up leaves in the fall. And there was a long list of minor complaints, but no amount of discussion about all the positive aspects were able to break through. And he, in turn, convinced all of his neighbors that trees were a terrible idea. And so as we went to that street, we got rejection notices from everybody, and it was really unsuccessful. And so that was an important lesson for us. And we realized that there were a lot of things that we needed to do better in order to engage more thoughtfully with the community. So one of the things that we decided to do as a result of that Riverside story is to really focus more on community engagement. and thinking about what the opportunities were to attend more community meetings, to do a better job communicating with community groups and leaders. I think the perception was that KIB was coming into a neighborhood. We didn't know the folks there as well as we could have. We weren't making as strong of an effort as we could have. We were, knocking on doors and hanging informational pieces of info at the doors, but were we doing enough? So one of the things that we decided to do is we do a lot of youth employment in the summer. And what better way to engage with folks and get them to open their doors than to deploy some of the youth that we hire in the summer. And so sent them out to help talk to neighbors about why we thought trees were important and trees were great. And they were very successful in getting out and changing hearts and minds. We did a lot also think about how better and more clearly to communicate what it was that we were talking about. And so created infographics like the one on the right here that describes what happens during a big rain event so that folks could understand that the trees actually are playing or could play an important role in making a difference. And everybody understands the need for a cleaner waterway and a cleaner White River. And that was, again, another way that we could start to make a difference. And yet, these were all good steps, but we're not done. And there's more still that we felt we can and should be doing. So I'm going to take a quick detour from my conversation about KIB. And Sarah mentioned that prior to coming to KIB, I worked for this lovely and strange nonprofit called Chazon. It is the biggest sustainability nonprofit for the Jewish community in the US. And my task was to think about, how do I make every synagogue, every community center, every school more sustainable? How do I make the buildings more sustainable? How do I make the programming inside the buildings more sustainable? How do I think about making the communities around those buildings more sustainable? And one of the interesting things when I first started that job, the CEO said, Jeremy, you've been working on sustainability issues for a long time. What has been the Jewish thread in all of that work? And I looked at him like a Cocker Spaniel. I sort of cocked my head to the side and I said, my wife and I are both Jewish. We're raising our children in a Jewish household. I consider myself culturally Jewish, but really, in terms of how devout and how serious I am, I would say I'm Jew-ish. I'm not terribly devout, and I had never given it serious thought. And I mentioned that to him, and he said, "Well, think about it." And so that really resonated with me. And the thing that has really struck me since that conversation is this idea that it actually doesn't matter what faith you have. All major faiths have something to say about caring for the world around us. So when I I'm moving to Indianapolis. I'm originally from the East Coast. And one of the things I discovered as I was moving to Indy is that there are more houses of worship per capita in Indianapolis than in any other major city in the country. And there are houses of worship of all flavors. And again, to reiterate, it doesn't matter whether you are Hindu or Buddhist or pagan or any part of the number of Christian, the rainbow of Christian beliefs or Jewish or others. there is something in either spiritual text or in practice that describes taking care of the world around us and thinking about what the opportunities are really through this obligation of a moral, thinking about it as a moral obligation to make a difference. So one of the first things that I was able to do was actually fairly recently. It was just this past October. We planted 200 trees in Garfield Park in Indianapolis. It was done as part of the city's mini bicentennial celebrations. That's why we picked the number 200. But what I was really thrilled about is that we were able to bring a number of different spiritual leaders to come together and each share a prayer from their respective faith about nature or creation care or something specific about trees. And here is a picture of that group that we brought together. And then they came together as pairs and were able to plant together. And so, I had somebody from the Hindu community and somebody from the pagan community side by side planting a tree together and talking about what they shared in common. And what was fascinating about that was thinking about what the opportunities were to really engage in a thoughtful way with the faith community in a way that many environmental organizations don't do. So subsequently, Keep Indianapolis Beautiful was part of the Spirit and Place Festival. And this is something that happens every year. And one of the things that we were able to talk about then was, again, a panel of folks from different faith backgrounds that were able to expand on this idea of trying to think about what the opportunity was and the obligation was. And one of the things that I shared in that panel, and I will share with you in here, is a story that I heard from Vop Osili. So Vop is the president of the city council in Indianapolis. And he shared this story about taking his 96-year-old mother to church and how the pastor complained that there was a vacant lot near the church that had a lot of litter and there were some weeds growing and it was, it was clearly abandoned, and that the city wasn't doing its job appropriately. And Vop was driving his mom home afterwards and said, Mom, I was thinking about what the pastor said. What would you have done in your day? And his mother has been going to the same church her entire life. And she said, I don't understand the question. We would have just gone across the street and picked it up. And he said, right. And so he said he drove back to church the next day and he went to his pastor and he said, you are my spiritual leader, but human to human, I want to tell you, you're wrong. And yes, it is the city's responsibility, but it is also our responsibility. If we want the area around our house of worship to look nice, then it's on us to make it look nice. And therefore, it's your responsibility as pastor to tell us that if we want the area around our church to look nice, guess what? We've got to roll up our sleeves and play a role in making that difference. And I said, I agree with you 100%. And think that, again, as we think about how we can make a difference, thinking about more opportunities with the faith community just keeps bubbling up as what I feel like is one of the most ripe chances for us to really make a difference. So I'm going to just show a couple more slides and then give you some concluding thoughts. So we have a mapping expert on our staff, and I asked him to look at where institutions were in Indianapolis that were registered with the IRS as a religious institution. And each of these white circles represents a circle around a house of worship, just in a few square miles of Indianapolis. If I zoomed out further, it would just be a blur of white circles, because there really are so many churches, mosques, synagogues, etc., throughout the city. But what's interesting is if you zoom in even further, what we started to do is look at areas within these circles. So in the center of each circle, there's a blue dot, which represents the actual location of that particular house of worship. But then in the surrounding circle, which is a 0.2 of a mile diameter, we can start to see that there is a huge opportunity for plantable space. One of the things that we are really thinking about and seeking is if we want to increase the tree canopy in Indianapolis, but really anywhere, where are the neighborhoods that could ask for it, that would want to engage with us, that would want to bring out volunteers, that would want to identify places nearby that they would like to beautify, that could understand different reasons why trees are important. And the answer is that working with some of these different faith institutions is really an amazing opportunity there. There is a huge amount of plantable space. As I mentioned, there is a huge desire to try to work with folks to do volunteer efforts to try to make their communities nicer. But also, one of the things that I mentioned earlier is that we have had a hard time this year during the pandemic mobilizing large crowds. Well, the same is true for houses of worship. There are certainly some exemptions, and I know the governor and the mayor are talking about slightly different rules and regulations that could be available for houses of worship to get slightly larger crowds inside. But really, there are lots of folks that are, rightly in my view, a little worried and cautious and reluctant to come inside a house of worship. And yet, there's a huge desire to still have that spiritual uplift and to find opportunities to connect and to do good work and to hear from their faith leader. And when I started to talk to a number of different faith leaders around the city, it was like pushing on an open door. I met with zero resistance. Folks said, that's amazing. You mean I could just have folks come together and do something nearby that would, where there's a clear story that I can tell, that there is a parable or a line from our sacred text or some other important way of communicating about this importance, and at the same time creating this opportunity to make the city a better place and give spiritual uplift at the same time. Where do I sign? I was also having a conversation with someone who is a doctor at one of the hospitals in the city, who belongs to a Mennonite church, and it is across the street from a Southern Baptist church, two very different communities, but they had initiated conversations to try to figure out how could they do some work together? What would the things be that they could genuinely find time to join together and do collectively? And I said, well, this is the thing. And he said, I think you're right. I think this is the thing. So I'm encouraging them to think about what those opportunities might be. But, ending with this idea of the steeple, if we also think about what the social role is that churches and houses of worship play, they are locations in neighborhoods where there is often somebody who is considered a community leader, where there is often opportunity to have community town hall meetings or gatherings, where there is additional social outreach, whether that is providing food or shelter or other social services. I know IU Health, for example, which is one of the big hospital systems in the city, is thinking about ways that they can do more distributed healthcare through houses of worship. I think, in conclusion, that as we start to think about how we build effective stakeholders and build an effective coalition of folks willing and eager to take on the task of beautifying the city, that the real opportunity before us is really doing more to engage with the faith community. And so for that reason, it's one of the things where as we move forward into the next few years, I anticipate that we are really going to be thinking about, from KIB's perspective, how do we improve environmental equity? Thinking about where are neighborhoods that need more environmental benefits or need access to more environmental benefits, and where are neighborhoods that have more environmental hazards, and what can we do to bring resources and assets to reduce those hazards. And I think that in partnership with those in the faith community, there's tremendous opportunity to bend the needle and to make a difference. So I think what I'm going to do is conclude my my remarks from the slides, and would love to just engage in conversation. And so if folks have thoughts about what I presented and would love to add comments in the chat box, I think Sarah and her team will throw those my way, but happy to respond to those as they come in.
Well, thank you so much, Jeremy. What wonderful work you're doing with KIB. And as you said, let's just jump right in to some of the questions and comments that folks have been putting in chat. And yeah, a reminder to folks, just add those into the chat and I'll curate those for Jeremy as we go along. So one came in that I think is really interesting. Not a religious studies scholar or a social scientist, but I think it's true that participation in organized religion has significantly declined, particularly among younger generations. Why invest so much in churches and synagogues and houses of worship? What do they offer? How do they offer more bang for the buck?
So I love that question. And I think that it is absolutely true that there are some institutions that are stable or declining in membership, but that is not universal, and that there certainly are communities that are growing. But I will share just a personal story, which is I mentioned that I'm moving to, permanently to Indianapolis, coming from Connecticut, and at our synagogue here in Connecticut, we had a rabbinic transition a few years ago, and the leading candidate to be our incoming senior rabbi was the person who was our junior rabbi. And what he would do during warm evenings, Friday evenings, is he would take his guitar and go down to Long Island Sound. We live close to the water in Long Island, and he would do an evening service down by the water. And you could bring a picnic blanket and bring a picnic, and your kids could run into the water, and it was all fine. And then we'd watch the sunset, and that would conclude the ceremony, and that would conclude the service. and everyone loved doing this. We were not wearing a coat and tie. We were not sitting in a pew. We were out in nature, getting some spiritual uplift, but also just having a sense of community and belonging. And when we wanted to survey our members and see who, what they wanted to see in the next senior rabbi, there was an open text box in the survey, and 160 families wrote in some variation of, "We want to see more Rabbi Evan on the beach." And so we knew that that actually was something that was really resonating. I do think that while there's truth to the statement that folks are maybe less inclined, particularly the younger generation, to do something indoors where they're sitting in a traditional brick building, the opportunity to actually do something outdoors is it's low-hanging fruit. It is ripe for engagement, and that's actually one of the reasons why I think different spiritual leaders are particularly excited about thinking about these partnership opportunities.
And that might be particularly more effective at a time when people feel trapped inside with the pandemic. I know, national park attendance and all of this is way up, right? I wonder if COVID has affected your volunteer groups or general engagement. Do you think people are more interested in knowing about trees and planting trees to be outside doing something together?
Yeah, so we have taken steps to be very cautious, and we have made sure that we were no further, we did not get in front of the mayor of Indianapolis, who was already a step behind the governor of Indiana. And so we've kept our group size to 25 people for outdoor events where physical distancing can happen. And one of the things that we found is that we actually do have those events that we do make happen. We get those volunteers to sign up right away. There is pent up demand for folks to join these efforts, but we are being very, very serious about capping those numbers. But I do think, one of the things that we have is a program called the Tree Tender program, where we train folks to plant trees the right way. So Sarah, I'm sure you can appreciate this, that there's a right way and a wrong way to plant trees. And so we do this sort of mini training for folks to be a tree tender. And we are finding that that's actually going to be something that I think we're going to be doing more of going forward, because having a bigger core of folks that have that level of training will enable us to send them out and with less direction and less oversight than we might otherwise need with a full-time arborist looking over them to make sure that enables us to get more trees planted, because the desire is there.
I love this question. Houses of worship, despite the religion, have commonalities. Do you have advice for starting a coalition on an environmental topic between seemingly disparate groups? Any actions to definitely do or definitely avoid?
Definitely do or definitely avoid. Well, so there are, I'm coming at this actually through, thinking about what Keep Indianapolis Beautiful can do with the work that we do. There are groups, there's nationally, there's a group called Interfaith Power and Light. And within Indiana, it's called Hoosier Interfaith Power and Light, which really is thinking about what the opportunities are at houses of worship to, put solar panels on their roof, to think about energy efficiency. It's really through an energy lens. And certainly if you can save money on your energy bill and be more renewable at the same time, well, that's great. But thinking about things that could be pursued together, what's interesting and what we uncovered in the conversation that we had as part of the Spirit and Place festival is that a lot of major religions, of course, align their holidays around the harvest cycle. And so there are times for planting and times for harvesting and so forth that are actually very closely aligned. And so I actually do think that thinking about the agricultural calendar can help identify some opportunities where there might be similar holidays and opportunities for different faiths to come together and do something together in a way that they might not have considered before.
You mentioned the future work for KIB, and someone stated, KIB does seem to be very important to help address systemic environmental and social justice issues in Indianapolis. You clearly agree. And how do you see that really fitting in to KIB's work in the future? And another person asked, that about what environmental hazards are you actually focused on? They were interested to know what exists within Indianapolis. What are they, and what are the next steps?
Sure. So just addressing the second part of that first, when we start to think about some of the hazards, some of them are related to things, again, where we feel like we can have a positive influence. So if we're thinking about heat island effect, for example, there are parts of the city that have, lack tree canopy, that have lots of concrete where we feel like we can make a difference. There are parts of the city that are more prone to flood events. And again, coming back to the relationship that we have with citizens energy, thinking about opportunities to plant trees as flood mitigation, because those trees will slow down and absorb a lot of water during rain events. Thinking about that as well. And then a third category is really just thinking about where litter happens, particularly thinking about storm drains and how all of it washes into the river, and so thinking about water quality, but what are the opportunities to prevent litter from flowing into sewers and drains and ultimately into the river. So that sort of addresses the hazard side of things. One thing though that I do want to mention is that historically, this is changing, and it's actually changing fairly rapidly. I think KIB has a more diverse staff and a more diverse board than it has had in the past, and we're continuing to be thoughtful about that and to work on that. But historically, it was a primarily white staff and it was a primarily white board. And so if we want to engage with different neighborhoods, then it helps if our staff and our board mirror the neighborhoods that where we want to work. And so it's so that is an important piece of this. But the other thing that's important is that if we have partnership with some of these houses of worship, again, they are often important beacons within a particular neighborhood where partnership with that pastor, that reverend, that priest, that rabbi, etc., are a way of engaging more thoughtfully, more genuinely with that community. And so it helps to have somebody who is seen as an authority figure in that neighborhood as an advocate for this work. And so I think that's the idea there of that partnership.
That's great. It's interesting to me, you showed the picture of the tree that was snapped off and told the story about, a community leader that persuaded the neighbors not to want the trees. And it struck me, that you said that the concern was that he didn't want to have to mow around the tree, right? But I think And then you talked about, leaf litter and having to deal with all of that. And in some ways, I do think, those are small problems, but actually, when you think about it from an environmental justice lens, those aren't small problems to some people, right? When they
Sure,
are dealing
sure.
with thinking about putting food on the table, right? Then having to have a little bit more time to mow or pick up leaf litter, really does make a difference, right? So how do we connect with that issue, like low income communities, when they are challenging you about the cost to them of putting trees in the ground? How does talking about the benefits of trees make a difference to them? How do we reach them?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and there are related questions, Sarah, about some of the maybe unanticipated benefits, but there's been research that has shown increase in property value associated with trees with streets that have better tree canopy, and some worries about gentrification and what that might mean as well. So in terms of not just an added burden, but actually leading toward displacement of folks that have lived there a long time. These are definitely tricky issues, and one of the things that we are doing is we have on our staff created a diversity task force. We are bringing in community members that are thinking about how we can address these issues thoughtfully, and again do it in the places where the benefits are understood and to those communities outweigh any of the negative issues. I will say that for trees that KIB plants, we are the ones who make sure that those trees are mulched and watered and pruned for the first 3 years after we plant them, to make sure that they are well established and don't require additional care, after which point they are fairly resilient themselves and able to take care of themselves. But there are some issues where agreed that leaf litter could be an issue, and that story about talking with a neighbor who said that he didn't want to turn the steering wheel on his his riding mower is a true story. I said, but this, you do use the steering wheel on your lawn, the rest of your lawn, but apparently using it one more time was just too much. So, we are careful about doing this and going where we are wanted and where folks do want to engage with us, and we don't plant if it's not wanted. So that's a clear piece of this, but it's a really great question, and it's something that we're going to be continuing to think about and work on going forward, to be thoughtful partners on this.
I think I just have to give KIB props. I'm very familiar with your youth tree team, and I feel like that's a place that you really have had a lot of diversity in your staff, and so I think that and you're now diversifying more among your full-time employees, as you said, and I think that that's going to be very useful to reach more communities. Well, Jeremy, we're at time. It's 1 o'clock, so want to respect that, and let me thank you very, very much on behalf of Indiana University and the Integrated Program in the Environment and the Environmental Resilience Institute for coming and spending your time with us today. It was really intriguing talk, and we're really thankful to have had you. So thank you very much.
Well, it was my pleasure, and thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. And to everybody, please join us next semester. Again, we'll start again on January 22nd with Phil Sharp. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.